Well, Craig, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast, Psyche. I know when I first reached out, it was still called Therapy for Guys. So we may get into some masculinity stuff, but we don't have
Sure.
to.
Sure.
Um, I guess before we jump into the conversation, would you mind just introducing yourself for the listeners and just talking about what you're up to and what you do? And then we can, yeah, jump into the conversation.
Sure. My name is Craig, and I think the way that EK had landed upon me or us is our podcast, Acid Horizon. And Acid Horizon is a theory podcast. It started just over 3 years ago at the very top of the pandemic. And the folks who are on the podcast now, we all met in a Discord server where we were discussing philosophy, particularly that of Deleuze and Guattari. And the basic ambition was to create a podcast that dealt with the many sort of figures that I would say are more or less within the scope of what we would call the post-structuralist movement. But beyond that as well, we wanted to discuss many of the mediators for the popular figures like Deleuze, Foucault, and others, going back as far as folks like Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, and so forth, and develop episodes around them. And then some of the progeny of that movement, in the early days, we dealt with the work of, for example, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. And then from there, getting into some theorists who are popular these days or are doing some relevant work, which extends from that lineage. After that, while I was doing that, so just a little bit about me. My
Sure.
background is I had my undergrad in philosophy. I then got a master's in education, and then I got a master's in philosophy. I've taught mostly, for a long time, I taught English to international students, and then I was teaching in the LA County jail system. And I was kind of set on a track to be that kind of diverse educator doing different things. More or less what I was doing was either like kind of college preparatory stuff
Sure.
or, like helping older students get their GEDs and that sort of thing. And that was kind of how I was fashioning my career. But then due to the pandemic, things kind of took a shift. And it also gave me an opportunity to rethink, some of the possibilities with respect to how I could bring philosophy back into my life. And I always wanted to try a podcast. And to make a long story short, I think we have had an unusual amount of success, or maybe a kind of rare success, in that we have a pretty broad listenership, but also we, amidst doing what we do, we attracted the attention of the folks who work and run Repeater Books, and now also Zero Books as well. And we do some of the work on the back end for them. We also put videos on their channel, and we also have publications out and coming out with Repeater Books. So I know, Kike, that you were very excited about the Philosopher's Tarot, and
Yes. Yes.
something that I created last year. Actually, it was kind of an ongoing incidental sort of meme project that manifested into a full-blown tarot deck. And then also we have a book coming out called Anti-Oculus, The Philosophy of Escape, which is basically an anti-cybernetics book.
Mm.
And we discuss some relevant themes. Not only do we talk about the sort of current political conjecture with respect to modern surveillance apparatuses, policing, and so forth, but also the sort of philosophical and epistemological grounds for which we sort of root our philosophy. So that's what we do. Also on our podcast, we have like some offshoot podcasts. We do our own sort of incidental, I guess you would say, psychology or psychologically oriented podcast called The Inner Experience. But we also bring in some different things like tarot, some occult stuff, and we use that as a kind of clearinghouse for these topics that are not
Sure.
strictly philosophical. So that's kind of the sort of encapsulated version of what we do.
Man, that's fucking awesome. Yeah, and you guys are one of the big ones, and I'm just so grateful that you've made the time to come on this kind of small and growing little podcast just to
Yeah.
connect with me and just kind of tell us more about your story. I actually was hoping, as a psychotherapist, I love learning about people's childhoods and the fantasies around that. I
Sure.
was kind of wondering, maybe as a starting point, if you could talk about how you first got interested in philosophy and maybe
Oh,
how that developed.
sure. Um, that's a good question. So, and I haven't thought much about. Well, I do know the story. Let's put it that way. So, um, like, I mean, I can't. Here's a question that I have for you, and just for the general population listening, like,
Sure.
who from a young age, like at what age does someone decide they want to be a philosopher? You know, like the
Right.
person who wants to be an archaeologist, like that's what I wanted to be when I was like 6 years
Okay.
old, right?
I wanted to be a writer.
Or okay, that's reasonable. A film director,
Yeah.
policeman, you know, that's what all the kids say. I want to be a
Right.
football player, right? But when does one say that they want to do philosophy? Well, in my case, I think there's a kind of lineage that builds up to it. I would say that I had a very imaginative upbringing. The
Mm.
one thing that my mom used to say about me is I could just play for hours on end by myself. I mean, we had kids in the neighborhood, but I would just be content to just sort of be ruminating on a pile of dirt and moss and rocks and everything like emerging out of that for literally hours on end. And then from there, maybe in my middle school days, and plus I was always into art and drawing and that sort of thing.
Okay.
But probably in my middle school days, I ventured to watch the entirety of Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth,
Oh,
uh,
wow.
which was an interview series that he did with Bill Moyers. And I went to the local library and like took out like whatever it was, the 4 or 6 like VHS tapes, or one at a time. You couldn't take the whole thing out all at once. And I went through that, and I think what that did was it allowed me to see, or it allowed me to consider that the interest that I had in terms of like stories, films, and so forth had something deeper happening there, right?
Mm.
Now, I mean, I've read Hero with a Thousand Faces, and you know that's something that I involved myself with as a young reader, and maybe am not as strongly committed to these days. But that was a sort of incipient blush with
Mm.
thought. And then from there, actually, my older brother was a big influence because he
Okay.
was oh, yeah, he was, well, you know how kids want to be an archaeologist? Well, he was an archaeologist. He studied archaeology, Middle Eastern
Nice.
studies, and anthropology. And he will tell you that the work of archaeology, I mean, it's basically like being in construction,
Sure.
essentially. You know, it's not as Indiana Jones makes it out to be. But he always had a really strong interest in history and anthropology, Egyptology, and all those sorts of
Mm.
things. So from a very young age, he was kind of an influence there.
Okay.
That role-playing games, and so you know, I grew up in a very working class kind of family. My parents loved fishing, hunting, NASCAR, all those sorts of things. All those things can be great and enlivening, but I was a bit of a black sheep of the family. And, you know, I have to say, thanks to my brother, it got me thinking about doing these other things. And actually, he was doing Middle Eastern studies. So I was like, well, I got to pick an area of the world to take a look. So I actually started looking at East Asia, you know, China and Japan in particular. And so
Sure.
I was really interested in the history and the religion and the language, particularly the religion and philosophy. And so it wasn't uncommon for a young man in the mid 1990s to, you know, immerse themselves in Taoism and Zen and all those sorts of things. And
Sure.
that sort of genre of literature that was available to people at, you know, your local Barnes and Noble or whatever, was, you know, like it was kind of a second heyday maybe after like the Beat generation, right, for that
Sure.
stuff. So that kind of got me started, and I actually went into college as an East Asian Studies major and a
Okay.
philosophy double major. So basically, I had a double major and a minor in Japanese too. And I would say that neither one of those really won out as like a dominant interest. I was able to like kind of do classes that fulfilled requirements for both majors. But along the way, I picked up an interest in Western philosophy. And
Okay.
that's probably how, you know, I get to where I am today. And so at that time, I was looking particularly at existentialists, you know, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, that sort of thing. And
Sure.
phenomenology was very popular at my school. So that was something else that I got into. And it was also at the time that like Jacques Derrida was quite trendy and so forth. And so from there, a cascade of thinkers came my way.
Yeah.
And the rest is history. And I kind of put it down for a while, and it wasn't really until maybe I would kind of like dip in and out over time, but I would say around the time that I did my master's, which was 2015 or thereabouts. And then since then, like I've maintained a pretty strong interest in the work that I'm currently working on.
Okay. Oh man, that's great. Okay, so I have just a couple questions in light of that, but maybe to begin, in terms of your family, was there a philosophical or spiritual, religious kind of background that maybe kind of shapes some of that like longing and journey? I'm
Hmm.
always curious to know where people kind of come from.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I would say, well, given what I just told you, I would say that my older brother was a big influence.
Yeah. How much older was he?
He was actually he is a half brother. He's 12 years older.
Okay.
And maybe one way to think about this is to think about it through the lens of something like myth or imagination.
Mm,
One thing that my brother was, and maybe even still is, particularly good at, was creating these sort of imaginal worlds for us. And
mm.
so when because he was literally a brother from a different mother, I would see him once every 2 weeks or so. And I
Okay.
was very excited when he came over because it was really something different. And so he would come to our house, and we had a basement. And when he came over, I would set up the basement in preparation for him because we would do all of these scenes. And one of the sort of like play settings that we always used to create was we would create we called it the pit pyre. It was a
Mm,
vampire who lived in a pit. And I mean, thinking about this through a mythological lens, I mean, really what we did is we took this trip to the underworld. And
mm,
so in this little thing, we would shut off all the lights. There was some treasure to find, but there was also basically this vampire down there that you had to avoid. And so my other younger brother and my younger sister and I, we'd go down with the flashlights and, the backpacks, and we would try to locate these treasures without getting trapped by this vampire.
Oh, that's
And,
great.
it's interesting. So I attribute my interest in philosophy and the idea of depth and the search for meaning to this kind of play that I used to engage in. Aside from that, I grew up basically in the Roman Catholic tradition.
Okay.
Um, and I think anyone who, like, I wasn't a very regular churchgoer, if at all. I used to go a couple times with my grandmother. I went to just like all the bad Catholics out there. We went during Christmas, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then I did catechism, so got
Okay.
baptized, confirmed, and all that sort of thing. So anybody who is Catholic, I would say there's a large percentage, like even if you become an atheist, for example, it's hard not to, have the smells and bells of the mass, sort of become part of the substrate of your, spiritual or religious memories, and it kind of infuses your imagination in a certain kind of way.
Oh,
So
yeah.
despite the fact that I'm not a practicing Catholic right now, that definitely sort of colored my spirituality. And I would say the sort of um, like the inner struggles, or at least the kind of inner combat that a young man does growing up, like in terms of, searching for the meaning of life. Should we live our life in a normal or in a moral or in a normal or this kind of way, as a Freudian?
Sure.
But yeah, so I would say that my being involved with the Catholic Church had something to do with that. My father's side of the family, like I think he wasn't as religious, although he definitely came from a Protestant background, and I think his values kind of show that. So I either had
Sure.
the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds, depending on how you want to look at that. Yeah, so that was that. And then I would say around the time that, I became a teenager, and realized that, I don't like the normal thing that's going on. Like I think a lot of teenagers are rebellious in that way, of
Oh
course.
yeah, for sure.
And so for me, taking a deep dive into East Asian philosophy. Actually, I did some Western, like I remember getting like Walter Kaufman's book, and like this is in middle school, late middle school or early
Dude,
high
that's
school.
impressive.
Like on Plato and I mean, I didn't have a freaking clue what was going on.
Okay.
I I think just letting the words course over you too.
Yeah.
This is true for anyone who comes to philosophy for the first time too, is that you don't have to get it right away, but sometimes it's just important to like stand under the waterfall of discourse for a
Mm,
while, and just kind of let that soak in and then take a second or third shot at it, you know.
yeah, well
Um,
said.
yeah. So yeah, that's kind of a fragmented view of my emergent like spirituality between the
Sure.
ages of maybe 6 and 16 years old.
Okay. Yeah. Well,
Mhm,
okay. So another question that was kind of coming up when you were first kind of telling your story
mhm. Yeah.
is, you talked about obviously being intellectually drawn to philosophy. I wonder what were the ways in which it kind of helped you navigate some of those emotional and existential struggles that not just a man, but if we're thinking
Yeah.
about the two of us, that kind of men kind of go through
Mm,
maybe after adolescence in their 20s and into their 30s. was
mm,
was was philosophy a resource to help you kind of process some of those crises or some of those developmental stages?
mm. Well, this will be a bit of a riff, but
Okay, please.
I
Hey
think
man, you're incredible at riffing, so that's why you're here.
well, I'll say this, and I never really thought about it in these terms, but I've been thinking a little bit about masculinity this morning.
Okay.
um, But I think for like, and maybe this is somewhat of a generational thing in
Okay.
the sense that,
And I think you and I are probably close in age. Just
yeah, I'm 45.
45. Okay, I'm almost 38.
Oh, okay, all right. So you're kind of like in the same millennial slash
Yeah.
Gen X.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm in
yeah.
that sort of weird ambivalent. I mean, I'm firmly Gen X by
Okay.
age, by the numbers, but
I think I'm right
perhaps.
at the edge.
but but anyway, in my case, yeah. So I think the idea of one thing that I know that you and I have maybe talked about a little bit online, or there's a term that we have circulated, is this idea of a minor masculinity, right?
Yeah.
Somebody who identifies with not only the masculine gender, but also perhaps some of the archetypal load that comes with that, if we want to
Mm,
talk about it in Jungian terms,
sure.
but also um, not completely identifying with all of the pressures or institutions that surround masculinity. That sometimes a young man who identifies as a man, but is perhaps confused or feels displaced by the expressions of masculinity that are out there,
Yes.
and maybe even the pressure to conform in certain areas, or maybe feel they don't measure up in certain ways, and can feel confused about that sort of thing. And just to let everybody know that this term minor masculinity, just to sort of give like where does this come from? This is
Sure.
actually a term that comes from Gerald Ronning, who is a philosopher, writer, theorist, and it's partially drawn from the work of Deleuze and Guattari and this notion of a minor becoming. And there's this idea that, even in a world of, where we have these, what we would call molar genders, like the gender binary, man or woman. Now we live in a world where that has been unsettled,
Right.
the firmness of those categories has been made wobbly. And, it sort of presupposes the idea also that if someone does identify with a man, there are going to, as a man, there are going to be ways in which that identity is going to experience a kind of slippage or
Mm,
nonconformity, or maybe isn't going to fit into the mold of their father, for example. And
right.
I think it also, and this isn't something that Gerald Ronning says, but something that I thought about earlier today is the way in which the notion of a minor masculinity can preserve, and I hear you using the word longing. You know, this
Mm,
is a word that Hillman uses to talk about, you know, the sort of visionary, you know, one of the ways he talks about it is the visionary aspect of what he calls the puer eternus, or the eternal child, who's
yeah,
often associated with masculinity, but
right.
a different kind of masculinity. And I think that it's important to see that within this divergent masculinity. Now, this can also be the case for the feminine, but there can be a kind of revolutionary aspect in the sense that um, the masculine figure, the puer eternus, the eternal child figure, is always has a vision of this kind of non-futurity,
Mm,
of seeking a sort of revolutionary height, a kind of experience that goes beyond, you know, the sort of ordinary sedentary values that we have, and sort of maintaining a kind of fire and flair for existence that is often stamped out not only by the categories with, you know, which can oppress us, but also by the very institutions within which we live,
mm,
and, you know, we find ourselves resigned to, you know, which is, you know, the institution of work, maybe the institution of family, it could be the institution of the church or the state, or what have you, but
sure.
any ways in which that expression becomes suppressed. And thinking about the ways, for example, where a kind of inherent creativity or a will to be creative is snuffed out or is dampened over time. And um, the notion of a minor masculinity could be a way to recover that, because I think what it does is it stands to acknowledge the ways in which our conformity to a certain mold or a certain expectation of who we're meant to be is ultimately impossible.
Mm. Yeah, that's
So
really good.
yeah. So anyway, that, I mean, I don't know if you want to say more on that. Maybe I've drifted a bit there, but
Well, no, no. So, okay, what's I think coming up, hopefully it's a connection. It's something I
Mhm,
wanted you to maybe reflect on for us a little bit is
mhm,
when I access social media nowadays, and really when I interact with a lot of young men in my therapy office,
mhm.
when it comes to kind of philosophy, a lot of them are accessing either someone like Jordan Peterson
Yeah.
or certain renditions of like Stoicism
Mm,
online.
mhm,
And
yeah.
and both of those movements tend to get connected to kind of a certain type of masculinity. And I'm
Right.
wondering if you see that trend and then kind of what you think about it. I know you've reflected on that on other
Yeah.
episodes, other podcasts, and I'm hoping you can maybe say something about that.
Yeah. So I guess the first question is, um, you know, we have to ask ourselves where these values come from. I think
Mm,
ultimately, like if I want to stay true to my sort of philosophical roots, I guess you could say, is that I think, well, but here's one way to think about it. Let me start from here. Um, you know, when it comes to young people, you know, often we do look for this mold within
mm,
which to form our identity. You know, we're seeking
sure.
certainty, right?
Oh yeah.
We're seeking a kind of enlivenment, which could be a kind of uncertainty as well. We're seeking love and connection, and a validation that goes with it. And while I think ultimately, existentially speaking, I think it's important for us to ascribe to higher values than just mere recognition. I think just, you know, to find one's footing in the society, you know, demands that, you know, often we cleave to certain models to develop ourselves. I think this is just something that we do. I mean, imagine a young person who discovers the guitar for the first time and they want to improve themselves. Well, what's one way to do it? Well, you find a guitar player you like and you copy all their riffs,
Oh
and so,
yeah.
and that just seems to be like a sort of sensible path to, you know, sort of getting a certain foundation or set of fundamentals down. But I think what happens is, amidst, the kind of flux and uncertainty that, we're living within, and not only that, the kind of hyper acceleration of images that we see online, and perhaps the way that one can feel sort of lost in the wash of all that, feel displaced, perhaps maybe in the absence of some kind of model, whether it be a parent, a brother, somebody in the community or whoever, through which to develop oneself. And given the fact that kids are online already, these Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson kind of figures, they present themselves with a kind of posture, that's assertive, it's confident, it
Yes.
seems to have all of the answers. And sometimes that in and of itself seems enough. I know that's something that I was drawn to, as a young person. I think the prospect too, when you attach that to the idea that certain values have been lost, we're losing our tradition, we're losing our footing. I think the uncertainty of a young man kind of runs into this narrative or discourse about, culture or society or civilization losing its way. And I think that's one of the reasons that young people, tend to buy into reactionary values, because they find a bit of themselves in that. To put it in maybe terms that you and I are familiar with, thinking about James Hillman's work,
Sure.
this is kind of a combat between the Senex and the Puer archetype here, because
Yeah.
somebody like Jordan Peterson is a completely Senex kind of character, right?
Yes.
The
Well
kind of
said.
values that he is attempting to impose or evoke are about how we've lost our way, how we've drifted from this figure of classical liberalism, for example, but then it has become so perverse that, I mean, I've seen that, people have followed him like, I'm not quite with you on this one, Mr. Peterson, or, they call him dad online, right?
Right, right. Yeah, that's a great
Right.
point.
And that sort of thing. But I think one of the things that, and by the way, thank you for sending me those lectures, the James Hillman, Senex and Puer lectures.
Oh, you are very welcome. I
Yeah,
really love those. That was
yeah,
great.
yeah. I mean, those were indispensable to sort of me sort of resurrecting that line of thought for myself.
Nice.
But one of the things that you'll kind of hear in like the first few lectures of that series are that young people, or at least the educators who are amongst the crowds who attended those lectures, observe that there is something ritualistic missing. There is a community that's missing, and there's a certain kind of experience that I don't know the adjective that we could use to describe it, but almost like a kind of wilding, or a kind
Mm.
of um, a convergence of this sort of initiatory experience,
Mm.
alongside a sense that a kind of either individual and or community autonomy is possible, that one can also acknowledge that there is a creative core that's within each one of us that does not have to submit to a particular set of values as they're present. And there's not a collective facility for young men, and maybe even young people altogether, to realize this. And hence, other kinds of figures become attractive. I had been reading this book by Pierre Klossowski recently, and he has a number of essays on Nietzsche's work. And while this might not seem relevant right off the bat, there's something that Klossowski says that I think kind of connects with what we're talking about here.
Okay, great.
Which is one of the things that people often think about Nietzsche's work is that the kinds of, the kind of ethic that Nietzsche wants us to cultivate might seem as if we want to return to this sort of irrationalist natural
Mm.
state, which often, like if we look at certain figures or literature, on the extreme right wing side of things. A lot of sort of the fascist imaginary often involves this idea of returning to one's natural state, escaping ideology,
Got
that sort
you.
of thing, and the kinds of things that societies are trying to impose on you. We're going to release our real power as men, that unfiltered masculinity, right? But the problem with that reading of Nietzsche, according to Klossowski, and perhaps the way that it's relevant to what we're talking about, is
Sure.
every generation and every appearance of a life, an individual or a community, is one that is beset with the task of confronting the absolute uniqueness of who they are, such that there is no return to a primordial, that our events as the lives of individuals and as the lives of communities, they are an instantiation of this eternal return process.
Mm,
But nothing returns to a beginning. It's always the eternalization of the process, such that the images that we live with psychologically and the way that we understand ourselves is almost insurrectionary. Like every set of images that we're confronted with gives us the possibility of living with something completely new. So even, the sort of initiatory rituals of young men from the 1800s all the way back to the year 800, BCE, for example, like
right.
there could be what we would call, an innate demand for each one of us to go through this initiatory threshold, to be socialized, to be inscribed within our society.
Sure.
But I think the message that we get from Klossowski's reading of Nietzsche is that there is, in every era and every epoch, I think, a challenge for us to, in our path to self-discovery, to find out what is new or novel within our individual or collective expression, such
Mm,
that it makes the possibility of returning to the past completely impossible. And
wow.
I think this is I just hit you with, I think, what I think are some deep ethics here. But
Oh, amazing.
but but what but the way that I think this is relevant is that young people are, especially young men, I think, are easily compelled, by those figures who make a promise of a kind of return to this figure of masculinity that's easily rendered into our notion of what a man should be, and I think
Yeah,
that's problematic.
sure. Can I ask you
For a
real
number of
quick?
reasons. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but do you see maybe Jordan Peterson's really strong emphasis on something like evolutionary psychology as kind of a type of return? And I'm not, obviously I'm not against evolution or science or anything like that, but
Mhm.
sometimes that kind of reliance on evolutionary psychology can be problematic, in my opinion. And I wonder if that's a type of return in the sense that you're talking about it.
I mean, my knee-jerk response to that is yes, but like, is there a particular claim that he's made that you have in mind? I have difficulty.
Just his whole thing about like lobsters and the
Oh, that,
hierarchies of nature and
yeah,
just almost basically a way of saying this is how it originally was,
right.
and if you deviate from that then you're somehow going against nature.
That's right. Yeah, this is precisely what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, so the conceit of Jordan Peterson and others like him is that there's this originariness, this
Yes.
naturalness that that if we lose touch with, then we are lost or we are less than. But the step that I'm taking alongside Klossowski and Nietzsche is that, the easy answer is it's socially constructed,
Right,
like that's the
right.
easy way out of this. But actually, I think metaphysically speaking, there's an even stronger step that we can take, which
Okay.
is to say that, this idea of nature, our theories of nature, and the will to truth that
Mm,
that exists in, um, like basically what lies at the bottom of Jordan Peterson's logic is and I'm thinking about this in kind of Nietzschean terms, is that
Sure.
he has a will to truth, that he believes that a sort of conformity to this particular image of nature is what's going to save us. But here's the
Right.
problem, is that there's these other images that come up. And these are the images and the sort of reality, I hate to use that word reality, but the other images of the here and now, the other compulsions, the other drives, the other things that our existence draws us to be. There are these other draws,
It's
right?
polytheistic, as Hillman might describe it.
Absolutely. And so if you set up this figure of masculinity in this kind of monotheistic way,
Sure.
that's bound to a certain truth of what a man should be, I mean, just by necessity, you have to exclude all of these other things that are going to appear.
Yes.
So, we live in a time, where, perhaps for the first time, in a long time, and maybe even if ever, where there can be a whole range of gender expression. I mean,
Right.
we're talking about masculinity, but, even beyond that, just different ways of living our lives.
Yes.
And just the appearance of that spectrum, threatens to undermine these figures. I mean, I think that's a wholly positive thing, because ultimately, where Jordan Peterson, wills the truth of masculinity, someone like myself, what do I, me, myself, I believe, and perhaps like alongside Klossowski and Nietzsche and others here, is
Sure.
that there's a way in which this, the release of these other images, these other possibilities, these other ways of imagining not only masculinity, femininity, non-binary gender, and so forth,
Sure.
is a volcanic and enlivening moment for many, many of us.
Mm.
So this stands to undermine the hegemony of these static, oppressive figures of gender. And this, you often hear the sort of refrain that, gender, the opening up or the explosion of the gender binary actually helps men out too. And this is what I mean by that,
Yeah.
right? Because what it does is it allows us to think a multiplicity of masculinities, right?
Absolutely.
And the thing of it is, I think one of the mistakes that we could be making is, there's this idea of toxic masculinity. We know what that looks like.
Right.
I think one of the challenges, though, is that in sort of deposing the hierarchy of, where the masculine term is at the top and then the feminine term is the subordinate term,
Hmm.
one of the problems is losing that term. It functions within the rhizome of other terms, with other forms of gender expression, and it also explodes into like basically a fractal of other masculinities as well, and gives us a way to imagine our lives in very different ways. And maybe that's one way to begin thinking about this concept that we've brought into the discussion.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Okay, so here's a question that's coming up. So I'm
Mhm.
kind of in conversation with a trans scholar, and he and I are wanting to work together to maybe host like a type of men's retreat or a gathering where we
Mm.
kind of explore different types of masculinities. And one of the things he said that kind of struck me was we have to be able to continue to talk about the wildness within
Mm.
masculinity. And I'm just curious if, because since you used that word, I don't, it may not be in the exact same way he was describing, but as you think about James Hillman and
Mm.
Nietzsche and other, philosophers that are important to you, how would you think about this wildness within the man? And I know, like, even putting it that way, not that it's monolithic in any way, but I would
Mm.
love for you to riff on that.
Hmm. Well, part of me wants to um, support Hillman's idea that there is this kind of revolutionary aspect, or visionary aspect of the puer aeternus figure. And
Okay.
that's only because I identify as a puer aeternus
Okay.
myself. And I see, so like one of the reasons I was so attracted to his writings, like, well, yeah, that's a lot like me.
Got you.
Um, I would say that, so yeah, to interrogate that, I think is important. Like, what does that mean for someone to have this sort of visionary power? Well, that's creative. I mean,
Mm.
the term wildness can be freighted with a lot of like naturalism. Maybe I
Yes.
think this is one of the things that we I would probably want to avoid. I I like the idea of minor becomings,
Okay.
which is for me is that there's always going to be, and maybe I'll elucidate an example of like what a minor becoming is or looks like.
Yeah, please.
Um, so the basic idea is, for Deleuze and Deleuze and Guattari is that, we're given a set of terms, man and woman, man and child, man and animal, man and molecule, right? Where man is always the sort of eminent figure in
Mm.
each one of these series. And the idea of a minor becoming is that there's always going to be something that's in excess of these polarities that we set up, right? And part of the ethical project of Deleuze and Guattari is to find ways to charge the subordinate pole, the woman, the child, the
Right.
animal, so that we can either come to occupy this space or this vector or this line that exists outside of this polarity, right? Because what happens is that these poles fail to either articulate or capture so many of the intensities that make up who we are. And I mean, sometimes there's the aspects to us that even escape the notion of gender or
Mm.
the notion of our humanity and so forth. Or the notion of ourselves as a kind of globalized figure. I mean, in states of like drug-induced ecstasy, we lose
Right.
ourselves in the moment, right? The question is, how can we do it without the drugs? This is what Deleuze asks us. And the question is, but I think ethically speaking, is like, how can we come to think about ourselves and our expressions that either overcomes or bypasses, or that either overcomes or bypasses these evolutionary polarities,
Okay.
and or how can we find a way to acknowledge that there's something happening within us that's always already escaping that.
Mm.
And so that's, I think there's almost a kind of via negativa way, I think,
Hmm.
to approach that, which is, we know what, these certain figures of global transcendent masculinity look like. We get them from our fathers, we get them from our teachers, our coaches, and that sort of thing. They're circulated on the media, and
Right.
they ossify before us, and it doesn't take us long to figure out what these things look like and how they function, at a very sort of like, in a very sort of intrinsic way. But the question is, how do we develop a dialogue with all of those things that are excluded from that,
Mm.
or the kind of intentionality that fails to be subsumed by those figures?
Yeah.
And that to me is the important question. To me, that's kind of wild in
Okay.
a sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
No, that's
You know,
great.
yeah. So if we want to get in touch, with who we are, and go off and do like a retreat or something like that, I think we should expect to find that there's been a lot of who we are that has been either jettisoned or deposited elsewhere. It's kind of in the offing. And when we find it, it might be in a place that doesn't appear masculine at all, or
Mm.
doesn't appear, to be the shadow of our father's masculinity or the coach's masculinity isn't looming over that.
Right.
And
Right.
I mean, we've seen these men in our lives, who have, almost fully succumbed to those figures. And from the outside looking in, it looks terrifying. Like when I see somebody who cannot think outside of the framework that has been imposed upon them by, their family or their school, or, some sort of, familiar figure that we see in the media. I
Sure.
mean, it's kind of depressing, like how would it be to sort of exist outside of that frame, or
Mm.
find something that's enlivening that doesn't sort of fit in the mold.
Yeah. Part of what I'm thinking of, to bring it back to James Hillman, I'll have to send you the quote. I forget exactly where he said it, but he develops this kind of image or this metaphor for the kind of this wild psyche, and he talks
Mm,
about like a carnival of sorts, and
mm,
he says there's tigers, and there's trapeze artists and the ringleader, and there's all these different, there's people that are really small, and some that are distorted and
mm,
giant, And he says,
Mm.
you know, the psyche contains it all. And
Yeah,
I wonder if that could be a type of wildness in the male psyche of sorts. This,
sure, sure. Yeah. And like I said, I was just reading that book by Klossowski,
sure,
and
sure.
he talks about the phrase that he used was this sort of insurrection of images. And so that's
Oh,
kind of wild.
that's
So just
really
imagine,
wild. I like that.
you know, so just imagine this kind of cavalcade or panoply or menagerie of all of these beasts and animals, kind of coming out. And um, there's going to be images that, stick out more than others for us, things
Yes.
that are recurrent. And I mean, if we're thinking, in terms of James Hillman's work, I think when we start interrogating an image or working with an image, often we find that it's doing things that are unique, surprising, unexpected.
Mm,
And I think this is the one thing that a certain view to archetypal psychology, or, maybe, like those folks who, are looking at like Jung's work, for example, and maybe they're not in therapy. I don't know. This is my imagination, but
yeah.
like somebody who takes, for example, like certain Greek gods, heroes, and myths as, kind of window dressing for, their identity and perhaps even their masculinity. But if you have a dream or a daydream or a fantasy or and some image that more or less finds itself in the particular archetypal threshold, um, I imagine, and this has often been the case, like when I did Jungian psychotherapy years ago, is that these images do some pretty surprising and unexpected things.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They fuck
And
with you in a lot of ways.
yeah, exactly. And I think that's like where the juice is, right? Like when you
Mm,
really start working with these images, if you want to talk about something that's wild or something that's like, I hate to, it's kind of like a colonialist sort of metaphor,
yeah.
a safari of
Mm,
sorts. But I think Hillman actually gives us, like a pretty good metaphor to work with, which is this idea of the underworld, that there is
yes.
this place that has sort of these inchoate mists,
Mm,
these beasts, these beings, and they don't speak in the accent of our day world language.
sure.
And developing a relationship with these things is not a heroic feat,
Mm,
right? And that's the other thing too. I think, I think Hillman gives us a really strong tool to talk about how we can sort of escape the figure of a dominant masculinity, which is setting aside the hero archetype. Now, granted, there's going to be times where we take we take heroic actions and we
sure.
embody that heroic archetype. It's we have dragons to slay now.
Yeah.
And the problem is that this archetype not only has been, like has completely saturated our worldview, but it's highly commodified besides,
Right. Oh
right?
yeah.
And so there's a way in which our extended romance with this hero
Mm,
figure has preempted our ability. Well, it has preempted interactions with these other images that may not be as heroic. And
mm,
that's the other thing that Hillman gives us too. He gives us a masculinized alternative to the hero, which is the figure of the Puer. This
yeah.
is a figure who is actually wounded and is sensitive and
Mm,
acknowledges this wound and its sensitivity and maintains a kind of vision, that and you know I guess you would say a moral mission of sorts, but not moral in the pious sense,
right,
but
right.
like in the sense that they're attempting to achieve some sort of ideal for themselves. That's actually the word that I'm looking for. It's not morality. It's a kind of idealism, in the good and strong sense, which is, I believe in something that's transcendent, that's beyond the given, right?
Yeah.
And I think for us, I think that could be a strong like archetype or metaphor to work with in some cases for some people, because there is such a profound givenness to the hero
Yeah.
and to the notion of the masculinized hero, that when this idea of the Puer figure comes along for some people, it really unsettles that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, man, this is so good. So, one maybe quick comment, and then I have a question about the Puer and the Senex and the lectures and one of the
Yeah.
chapters in the book that we read. Uh,
Sure.
I'm thinking maybe maybe I'm getting this completely off, and you can help me untangle it. But it strikes me at one level that going back to what you were saying about this return to the natural is something
Mm,
that's like co-opted by certain groups.
yeah.
There's a sense in which the wild for me has connotations of like nature and being outdoors at a certain level, but it's not about a type of order and control. It's
Mm,
about a type of disorder or a wildness where things aren't necessarily contained.
right.
And I wonder if that, I don't know. I wonder kind of what comes up for you and kind of thinking through those two.
Yeah, I mean, I would be absolutely lying to you if I said that I didn't love, being outdoors and in the wild. Like you've probably seen photos of my
Oh,
place
no, totally.
online, right?
I love all the animals and the rabbits that you
Yeah.
share.
So that, there's definitely a strong connection for me there. Um, However, at the same time, I think, in terms of, you know, I think one of the things that we're talking about is a kind of repression too,
Yeah.
or at least this figure of repression. And one of the concerns that I have is that in addressing this figure of repression, if we are using a kind of transgression or a return to the natural as a way to overcome the repression,
Hmm.
but in the end, that somehow gets folded back into the repression. That was a sort of temporary tangent from it, or that could be an expression of it,
Yeah.
right? So I think there's a risk there. At the same time, I think there is this sort of yearning for a kind of festival, right?
Festival. That's
A
it.
festival,
Yeah.
yeah, a festival, which is, and this is an idea I guess I'm somewhat committed to. I mean,
Okay.
especially when I read like somebody like Bataille, for example, you know, who he raises the he evokes these figures of the kind of sacrifices that we see you know from the Aztecs, the
Hmm.
potlatch ceremonies and so forth, which through the lens of today's morality, would just be absolutely horrible. Heads getting lopped off, rolling down, right? The steps
Right.
of the temple, killing slaves as a way to like pay off debts and that sort of thing. Yeah,
Sure.
that just wouldn't fly. But the one thing that Bataille acknowledges amidst all of that is that these expressions tend to come out of the demand for a non-productive expenditure, right?
Mm.
And so just to maybe bring Bataille into, and this is a riff here, but like
Yeah.
I've been thinking
Yeah.
about this,
Please.
like if you were to bring Bataille into Hillman's notion of the puer aeternus, um, the one thing that's interesting about the puer aeternus figure is that it lacks a sense of futurity. Its
Mm.
sense of temporality is different than that of the hero. The hero has a sort of linear nature. Like here's the beginning of the
Sure.
journey, here's the end of it.
There's a task to accomplish.
Right. But there's this other kind of, if we're thinking through the archetype of the puer aeternus, the idea of a futurity or a finality is one that's relatively absent. And I think there's a connection there to be made with the festival, because the
Okay.
purpose, quote unquote, of the festival is without purpose insofar as it's, this paroxysm of wasted energy, quote unquote, wasted life. And it's all done in the name of pure expenditure.
Mm.
And I think what's yearning or longing within us, psychologically speaking, when we think about things like retreats and we think about things like wilding or getting back to nature, is partaking in a collective kind of expression that's in excess of language, that's in
Yeah.
excess of discourse. And I think there's some risks there because, I mean,
Mm.
war is a lot like this,
Oh yeah. And Hillman writes about that.
right? And and this is what Bataille writes about too. And so there's definitely a convergence of those ideas. And so in the absence of the kind of community that would allow, and this is part of, we could say that there's a kind of a paradox here, that we're attempting to set up communities intentionally so that we can expend without purpose. Right. But at the same time, if your social structure isn't set up in such a way to allow that kind of expenditure to take place, it's going to blow up. This is the theory of somebody like Bataille that we see in his book, the Accursed Share series, or The Limit of the Useful, which just came out. And, that's problematic, so, if we want to live, we want to enjoy our life, we want to live a fruitful life, we want to find ways to partake in those non-productive expenditures that don't end up, in a Holocaust.
Yes. Okay. So Craig, is this non-productive expenditure, is it connected in your imagination at all with what Hillman was talking about in the lectures in the book, his idea of pathos, or that kind of desire that just desires? There's no like real end in sight. There's nothing that can really satiate it. It's just a type of ongoing desire.
Let me think. Yeah, I mean, the idea of pathos is, this kind of unsatisfiable yearning.
Right.
This yearning that's unable to locate its object in some ways. I mean, it sounds a lot when you hear Hillman talk about it. It sounds a little bit like Lacan's idea of lack.
Yes.
Right?
I thought the same thing.
Yeah.
I was actually going to check with some Lacanians to ask him about that.
I mean, there's definitely a resonance there. I mean, if you're looking at it from a Deleuze Guattarian lens, all lacks are constructed in some ways. But you know what? I think there is a Deleuzean way to kind of think about pathos in some sense, because the way that Hillman comes back to it is he inverts the whole pathos thing. Maybe, I don't know if it's in the Senex and Puer lectures, maybe it was, but do you remember when Hillman says something to the effect of the longing for love versus the love of the longing?
Yes.
Right. And so an act of accomplishment, I don't know if that's the right word, accomplishment, but I would say the kind of gesture of that Hillman endorses is making that move where we fall in love with the longing that we feel, and not completely suffer in the absence of the object that's being longed for. And I think there is something important to that. I think that, we could call it individuation, we could call it like a kind of spiritual maturity or something, but to be able to have this non-discursive relationship, with this, this constant inchoate sense of something not being satisfied, but understanding that is in some ways the kind of motor of our creativity and the possibility of our spiritual well-being, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Okay. Do you have time for, it's maybe like it's one question, but it's maybe looking at it from,
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
thinking through, Hillman and the Puer Senex lectures, and the book, I guess I'm just, especially since you've identified with the kind of the Puer archetype and that energy, I'm just wondering, have you found a way for yourself to maybe bring the two together? And and then I guess really it's kind of the same question, but do you remember his image or the archetype of I think it was the Caritas Romana, the old man nursing at the breast of the young maiden and the young woman? I'm just curious if that connects with you in any way. So two questions, but kind of getting at the same.
Yeah, that I was thinking about something along similar lines today, which was, Hillman in that lecture series, if you remember, says something to the effect of images or archetypes never really go away. They're not abolished. They just go underground, or they find different modes of expression. And you know, the reason that that's important to me is that I acknowledge that personally, maybe even politically to a certain extent, that I express myself in a very Puer way,
Okay.
right? So that leaves the question, you know, if what Hillman says about archetypes is correct, that leaves the question open as to whether, like, well, where does Craig's Senex pop up, you know, right?
Yeah.
Where does Kike's Puer pop up, you know? And that's the right question for Hillman. You know, like, where do we find this expression within our lives?
Yes.
Where are these little revolutions taking place, or where might they be nascent?
Mm.
And I don't know if I completely subscribe to the idea that we need to be balanced or within an equilibrium. I don't think Hillman does.
I
In
don't think
fact,
he does.
no. And I'm in agreement with him, because, you know, some lives are lived to be devastating. Some lives are lived
Yeah.
to be, um, you know, maybe ponderous in some ways. Some lives are lived, they find their sense of individuation in being light and free, you know, like
Absolutely.
that's like, you know, there's an abundance of difference out there. Um,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean for him those archetypes aren't finding expression in some way or another.
Right.
So, and that's the preface. So with all that said, I think for me, like, for example, like doing this podcast and everything was definitely an affirmation of the Puer aspect, kind of coming back to it in a way, because I think I had cloven myself to the a more Senex type attitude when I went
Interesting.
to education. Like,
Okay.
when I made that move, because I think for me, well, for one thing, there was a like a socio-political reality, which was I need a job. You know, it'd be nice to
You got to
get
pay the fucking bills. Yeah.
a pension, perhaps, I don't know,
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
like that. And so, you know, I got on that track. And
Mhm.
if you've ever been, you know, amongst educators and, you know, like sat at a teachers meeting, it's a very Senex kind of
Oh yeah.
recipient, you know,
Both of my
the way that
parents were
we,
teachers, so yeah.
yeah. So, you know, so like you probably have been inculcated with those values in some way,
Yes.
and they're going to appear for you. And I think in my case, like, my dad's biggest fear was that my, you know, to use Hillman's terms, that
Sure.
my Puer aspect was just gonna, like, put the family in debt somehow. Like, I was just gonna, like, go out and, like, you know, steal an expensive car and crash it into another expensive car, you know, like, and he was right to think that, to be
Got
honest,
you.
you know. So he was definitely, you
So
know,
what
that
kind of
was,
car did you steal?
oh man, I I never
That's
stole a
another
car.
episode, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll give a bit of. I never stole a car, but and I did get in trouble with the police. I did start up a crane.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
impressive.
Don't have a middle schooler operate a crane. Anyway, but anyway, but anyway, with that said, you know, like, I think the in terms of the Senex expression in my life, I mean, like in my relationship with my wife, for example, very Senex, and she acknowledges it. And, you know, to kind of use Hillman's metaphor yet again, I think that's one of the reasons that she was attracted to me, because she didn't have
Yeah.
Puer aspect in her life. And I
Mm,
think that distribution and that imbalance is what can create an enlivening situation, but it can also create disaster too, as you hear in many of,
absolutely.
yeah.
It's
So
probably both
yeah,
always in some
yeah,
ways.
right. So I think, and you know, that was the interesting thing to me about those Hillman lectures too.
Mm,
Which, by the way, you should link them at the end, because, like, if folks are interested in James Hillman, these are some of the most um, interesting things that he puts out there. But
that's a great idea. I'll do that. Yeah.
yeah, the thing that I noticed is that even Hillman, as an old man, what was he, in his 80s at the time that he was doing
I
that, or
think so. Yeah.
late 70s? All of it was particularly women who were in the audience
Yes.
lamented all of their run-ins or relationships with male Puer
With the
figures.
Puer figure. Yeah.
Yeah, but he's scouring the audience. It's like, anybody got a revolution out there?
Yeah.
And it was just interesting to see the disconnect that these oh, there's my puppy. Sorry about that.
No
But,
worries.
it's almost their dinner time. But anyway, I just thought that disconnect was interesting, because I think what we experience there is, to use this term, a kind of dialectic that we experience,
Right.
the Puer and Senex, this
Sure.
kind of contestation or opposition that we hear from time to time, or experience from time to time, and that's, I think that's the nature of the beast that
Mm.
Hillman is confronting. Is how do we? He wants to recover this figure of the Puer. He wants to find it like where he found it in like the May '68 movements and the revolutions and the counterculture stuff that was happening in the late '60s, and find out where it has gone. And in that series of lectures, and I think that was recorded more like 2008, 2009, something like that. Some folks said, well, it's happening online now. And I think that person, I think that person was correct in saying that, what you see in online interactions is very much an expression of the Puer archetype and the kinds of cultures that are taking place and the kinds of solidarity that happens online. And even in certain political movements too, the way that online culture has, sort of filtered into activism on the outside, but it's also been the other way too. There's been, we see a very strong dose of Senex energy, coming out of like extremist movements on the right.
Oh yeah.
It's, and I mean, even within particular, like a particular portion of the left-wing political spectrum, one could say that there's a Senex and Puer there as well. That's probably the case too on the right.
Would you mind? I mean, I know I said that was the last question. I usually lie because what would be the Senex and Puer kind of energies that you see on the left? That's fascinating.
Without putting too fine a point on it, although I could,
and probably very well.
Well, let's put it this way. I think there is I mean, one could say it splits firmly between like Marxists and anarchists, right? But I would say anyone who is invested in a kind of constituent power that attempts to conserve elements of society, whether it be the state, the family, maybe parliamentary politics, maybe the apparatus of social welfare, or what have you. And I mean, like I said, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, because let's face it, some of those people need that check tomorrow to survive. So I'm not going to disparage those people. But there is a fantasy, I think, that inhabits, some aspects of the, of those who wish to conserve or repeat things that have happened, in left-wing history. Whereas, the current political moment and, the next 5 or 10 years is probably going to look very different than 1917 looked or 1848 looked, and, especially given, the influence of social media and, the sort of the cybernetic world that we live in, the cybernetic present that we live within, is going to be absolutely, necessary, or at least absolutely influential in determining what, a new politics is going to look like. So with that said, and I'll say this too, you see it in online politics, particularly like when one side will level accusations of the other side being unserious, or that they are infantile. I mean, those are Senex accusations against the
very true.
And I mean, it goes the other way too. You guys are smoldering in tradition in a very like sort of Saturn oriented way. I would say there's, we could say that there are Saturn figures, right? And there are Peter Pan figures, to sort of use the mythological metaphors to talk about the way that politics is undertaken.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, Craig, I just am so grateful for your time. This was a really incredible conversation. If there's anyone that's listening that wants to connect with you or your podcast or get the tarot deck, I mean, is there one place they can go to, or where would you point
Sure.
people to? And I can include all the links in the show notes.
Yeah, I guess the best place is Twitter because
Okay.
we have a link tree in the bio in Twitter. So it's Acid Horizon Pod at Acid Horizon Pod, or just find Acid Horizon Podcast. Or if you just want to connect to us and you don't use Twitter, you find our Patreon account, YouTube. We all know how to do it. You just slide it in Google and out comes all the links, right? So.
Absolutely. Well, okay, so would you mind just ending by saying the line of the podcast, which is just continue the conversation, which just kind of tries to capture my spirit, and the
uh,
goal of starting this is just, having deeper conversations with people.
mhm. uh, how do you mean?
So just say continue the conversation.
Oh, so continue the conversation.
Perfect. Thank you.